Good evening, my Lynn N Things family and friends. Welcome back to the channel, guys. It's Saturday, and you know what that means. I've been a little busy today, so I won't be in front of the camera, but I will be doing my reading for you guys still. I just needed to get a little rest. So, y'all know how this goes. We are on our next chapter of the book about Cicely Tyson, Just As I Am. And y'all, we are on chapter 20. Can you believe it? Chapter 20. I have so been enjoying you guys, and I hope that you guys have been enjoying the readings. So before we get started, y'all already know we have to light a candle. So we got our candle here, and this is one of the Yardley candles. This is the almond and oat candle. Oh, smells so good. I have never burned this one yet, so we're gonna light this right quick. I have burned the lemon verbena. There we go. So we got our little light there. Let's see if y'all can see it. Yeah, so we got a little light burning there. Got myself a little cocoa. And y'all, we're going to jump right in. If you are one of my Lynn Loyals and you have been with me from the beginning, thank you so very much. And if you are one of my new viewers, thank you so much for subscribing to the channel. I am so happy to have you here. And I hope that you enjoy this reading. Like I say, this is chapter 20, and the heading of this chapter is Threadbare. Okay, guys, here we go. Oh, and remember, I will be putting all of these readings in a playlist, and it is titled Story Time with Lynn. So if you're new and you'd like to hear this whole book, you definitely can go back to my Story Time with Lynn playlist, and you are able to watch them from the beginning to now if you would like to do that to catch up and to hear this story. Okay, guys, we're going to start chapter 20, Threadbare. Relationships are knitted together by need. When two people connect, the purpose each is serving in others' life is what holds the union in place, keeps the ragged edges of its hemline sewn. My need to nurse Miles back to health fit perfectly with his need to be nurtured. And for the first few years of our union, that dynamic bound us tightly. But as Miles outgrew the desire for a caretaker, and I became less tolerant of what ailed him, our marriage began unraveling. The loose thread, the one strand threatening to pull apart our entire union, appeared in the summer of 1984. Long before then, there were signs of fraying. After the Marlon Brando incident came its other jealous tirades of his. One evening when Miles and I attended the opening of one of my mini films, he spotted playwright Chuck Gordon, author of No Place to Be Somebody, and the first African American to win a Pulitzer Prize for drama, talking to me. Miles stormed over and inserted himself in between us. "What are you doing in her face?" he says, forcefully enough to shower Chuck's nose. Miles, I say, pulling him away. "It's all right, we're just talking." There I was, dressed to the nines in my sequin gown, and I wasn't about to let Miles ruin my celebration. He seemed convinced that all men were attempting to steal his wife. Miles's roving eye was proof in his mind of everybody else or everyone else's. Anybody who knows me can tell you that I did not sniff around while I was with Miles. Was never even open to other people's advances. But Miles wanted to own me. You always seek to control others when you are not in full ownership of yourself. Other peculiar behavior had abounded as well, particularly when Miles had been using. One afternoon I spotted him through the front window of our townhouse, strutting toward the front door. Once we were married, we lived between his place and mine on the other side of town, an apartment that I had purchased on the Upper East Side right along Central Park. Now Miles, even if he had his keys in his hand, always rang the doorbell at his place. For whatever reason, he wanted me to come down from upstairs and open the door for him. Yet on this day, he entered on his own and left the door ajar. I glanced, and at his glazed eyes said to myself, uh-oh, he's under. That's when I took my little whiny behind, as my mama would have called it, and laid down on the couch. I knew not to mess with this man when he was high. And then there were the women. Miles kept his extramarital exploits mostly out of my sight. Yet they were never invisible to my third eye. I always knew when Miles was stepping out on our marriage. Just as my mother had known of my dad's unfaithfulness, I didn't need to be in the room to sense that it was occurring. Occasionally, evidence of his infidelity presented itself under the noonday sun, like it had in our first years together when Betty had shown up at his door. Once when I had confronted Miles about his womanizing, he had the gumption to say, I wish you go out and find somebody or see somebody. If I lifted my skirt around town, Miles reasoned, he'd feel less guilty about his sexual adventures. I did not respond, not with words anyway. As irrefutable proof of his affairs mounted, I pulled away physically. And on the occasions when we were intimate, I insisted that he use protection. We both knew why. It is astonishing even to me that I did not walk away from Miles at that juncture. In one sense, I pitied him even more than I loved him. How can you be angry at a man so broken, so intent on destroying himself? In another sense, I scorned him, resented that what he was doing to me was exactly what my own father had done to my mom. That he was brazenly betraying our vows. I was reliving my mother's story. A plot line I realize now that I had unwittingly set up. When Miles and I had reconnected after years apart, I knew exactly who this man was. He had demonstrated that during our first time together, and it stood to reason that his behaviors would continue as they did, especially once he had gotten off his crutches and back on his trumpet. When Miles cheated, he resumed the cycle that he had set up during our first go-round. I knew when he either snorted drugs or hooked up with some woman, because, as before, he'd come bounding home with diamonds, racks of clothes, and enough flowers to host a funeral, as if those items would somehow erase the damage that he had done to me emotionally and spiritually. Nothing whips anybody's tail like guilt. In place of gifts, I longed for him to respect the promises that we had made. On some evenings when he came in late after being out in the clubs with women, he'd slip through the front door and tiptoe to our bathroom, wiping off the lipstick on his mouth and neck. He'd then shower, put on his bedclothes, and sidle up next to me in bed. I'd lie there saying to myself, did this man think I'm stupid? Doesn't he know I'm aware of his behavior? As he pulled me toward him, I pretended to be asleep while fuming privately. The thread that began unspooling our union came just after a lovely spring had given way to summer's first heat. I had traveled out west to work on a project, and Miles, who was preparing to go on tour, had stayed at the Upper East Side apartment in New York. Though Miles still had his Upper West brownstone, and I of course still had my first apartment around the corner on 74th, we mostly lived between my place on 5th Avenue and the Malibu Beach House. Just as I was settling in at the beach house, my maid, an elderly Jamaican woman by the name of Jean, had called me. You know, Miss Tyson, Jean said, this is really none of my business. My throat got a little tight. What's none of your business? I asked her. Well, she stammers, I just don't think what Miles is doing is proper. Proper? What are you talking about? Well, she went on, there's a lady who lives in your building. She's married and she has a son. But the minute you leave here to go out of town, she is in this apartment with Miles. I clutched the phone and pressed it into my ear. What lady are you talking about? I asked calmly. though Hades had raged within me. She described somebody I had seen, a white woman with a thick mane of curls sprawled all over her head. I hadn't even spoken to her, but her husband often smiled and nodded when he saw me. Do you mean the woman with the bushy hair? I pressed on. Yeah, she says. She comes up here to your place and sometimes he goes down to hers. There was more. Every morning around 10 o'clock, revealed Jean, Miles and this woman would meet up right in front of the building and head off for a brief stroll around Madison Avenue. Then they would circle back around to the building, which overlooked Central Park. My maid, the elevator operator, the doorman, all three had been whispering about this liaison, stunned that Miles would risk being seen with another woman in and around my apartment. I thanked my housekeeper and I hung up the phone and I booked the flight back to New York. After seething privately for a time, I broached the subject with Miles in a doozy of an argument that shook Fifth Avenue. He predictably denied the affair, claiming that he and this woman were merely professional acquaintances. The maid had misunderstood, he told me. According to Miles, this woman, an artist and sculptor, had been teaching him to paint. Months earlier, Miles had been doodling all over the place when I noticed him sketching directly onto our furniture. I had gone down to Lee's art shop on 57th Street near Carnegie Hall and bought him paper and tools. Apparently, he turned to this woman for some tutoring. And yet, based on the claw marks that I noticed on his back and stomach, she was teaching him a lot more than how to wield a paintbrush. During the fracas, I threatened to divorce Miles, and he pleaded for me to stay. Then, in typical fashion, over the next few days, he presented me with a diamond brooch and another mink coat. Let me tell you something about myself. If this white woman hadn't dared to grin in my direction, I likely would have stepped right on past her and gone up quietly into the elevator. I had done exactly that on several times before now. But the fact that she had the audacity not only to look me in my black face and smile, but also to answer flippantly disturbed me beyond measure. Please don't do that, I said to myself. Please don't start acting like I don't know that you're sleeping with my husband. I stepped toward her, and though she didn't push me, she raised her legs as if she was going to. Well, honey, she should not have done that. But the next thing I knew, that woman was on the ground. I'm not entirely sure how she got there. Trauma has a way of clouding one's memory. But on the other side of my momentary blackout, I do recall that both the doorman and the building manager whisked me into the elevator. Miss Tyson, come with us, the doorman urged. With that woman still sprawled out on the ground, they escorted me up to my apartment where Miles had awaited. Before I had a chance to light into Miles, the doorbell had rang. Miles stayed in the bedroom as I flung open the door. There stood the woman's husband, his face the color of cotton. He was dressed in a suit as if he had been on his way to work. Hello, Miss Tyson, he says. I'm so sorry to disturb you. My wife said the two of you had a little problem. I glared at him through eyes wide as dinner plates. A problem? I said. No, sir. I don't have a problem. Your wife is the one with the problem. You tell her that I said she is to stay out of my apartment. He kind of loosened his tie and dropped his eyes to the floor and then looked back at me. She tells me that they're working on art projects together, he went on. I think there's been a misunderstanding. My laugh cut him short. Yeah, they're working on something all right, I smirked, and I'm glad that you know that they are. That was my way of revealing to him that despite whatever his wife told him, she and Miles had fallen into bed. I straightened my spine and stared at him without flinching. Now I'm going to say this one more time. I said it real slow, emphasizing every syllable. Please tell your wife to stay out of my apartment. Before he could respond, I slammed the door. Our conflict curtailed the affair for a time, but it did not end it. The disgrace, however, did relocate across town to Miles's brownstone, or else to the woman's apartment when her husband was at work. Our thriller in Manila in the building lobby had scared both her and Miles away from my four walls. My maid, who had cleaned all of our residences, dutifully continued her field reports, once telling me of the day when this woman had left a stoned Miles just outside of the front door of my apartment, several floors above hers. She apparently didn't want to put him on the elevator in such a state, so she led him up to the stairwell. She then rang the bell and left him for my maid to find. As my marriage stretched apart at the seams, black Democrats rallied around the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the first African American to run a nationwide primary campaign in pursuit of the presidency. Jesse had set his political table on the legacies of Channing E. Phillips, the civil rights leader who in 1968 made history as the first black nominated for presidency by a major political party. Charlene Mitchell, the first African American woman to run for the nation's highest office, which she did in 1968 as a third-party candidate, and of course the formidable Shirley Chisholm, who placed in the 1972 presidential campaign, widened the public's imagination of how power can look and sound. Reverend Jesse Jackson ran twice, in 1984 and in 1988, and his first campaign coincided with my heyday as an actress. This was my era. Sounder and Jane Pittman had introduced me to the masses, while King, Roots, and A Woman Called Moses had deepened the connection. The scores of roles that followed, those I played as well as those I wouldn't touch because they chipped away at our dignity, reinforced my stance as a race warrior. Throughout the late 70s and 80s, my phone rang off the hook with requests for me to speak here or appear there. On the eve of 1984 Democratic Convention in San Francisco, Reverend Jesse Jackson came a-calling. "Miss Tyson," he said with a smile in his voice, "would you be so kind to speak at this year's convention?" I laughed as a shot of nervousness surged through me. "Absolutely," I heard myself telling Jesse. "It would be my honor." I tell you, boy, Sojourner Spirit came through me through that speech. I drew in a breath, squared my shoulders. I'm sorry, y'all. The following year, as I arrived at the convention, my hands got to trembling. They trembled even more when backstage, Jesse's team had ushered me around like I was a queen. I rarely got nervous before taking a stage, but this was no ordinary event. I had never even attended a political convention, much less spoken at one, and judging by the way my poor heart palpitated, it frightened me. I whispered a prayer before walking out to the roar of spectators, hundreds of them, waving banners for Reverend Jackson and Walter Mondale and Gary Hart. Upon taking the podium, dressed head to toe in white, as my nod to the suffragists, I paused, overcome by the notion that I was standing there. My palms felt cold as clay. I called on Sojourner's Spirit. It carried through me that speech. I drew in a breath, squared my shoulders the way she must have, and imagined the bravery she had to summon. Calling on her courage, I began. "Well, children," I said into the microphone, "where there is so much racket, there must be something off kilter. I think that betwixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, these white men gonna be in a fix pretty soon." The stadium erupted into whoops and shouts, which gave me a moment of further compose myself. "But what's all this here talking about?" I went on. "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Thunderous applause ascended unto the rafters, while I, exhaling every refrain, gave myself over to the experience. Nerves have a way of disappearing when you think less about your performance and more about your purpose in speaking. Jesse's campaign came bearing additional treasures, one for me personally. Backstage at the convention, I met a young lady by the name of Minion Moore, who was then on Reverend Jackson's team. She had been the one to arrange my appearance, and in doing so, the two of us struck up a friendship that extends to this day. Following her work on Jesse's campaign, the brilliant Minion went on to become a political powerhouse, overseeing the Democratic Party as Chief Executive Officer of the Democratic National Committee, advising the campaigns of Michael Dukakis, both Clintons, and a long list of other Democratic luminaries. During the years when Minion worked in the Clinton administration, she had invited me to various White House events, including the elaborate 1994 state dinner for Nelson Mandela, then President of South Africa, and the man who had pushed apartheid down onto its knees. Not long after Mandela's release from prison in 1990, I had met him and the vibrant Winnie in South Africa. I had even stood in the 8 by 7 foot concrete cell at Robben Island where Nelson spent 18 of his 27 years in captivity. That was an experience and a half. On the day of my visit, an iron bed sat in the corner of the cell. That was never there while Mr. Mandela was in prison, the guard told me. Nelson slept on the hard floor for all of his years in prison. There, during the long nights, down on the unforgiving pavement, Nelson secretly handwrote the first drafts of what would become his internationally acclaimed 1994 autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. What a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. This young lady, Minion, she's part of that tribe of mighty sisters known as the Colored Girls, 5 unstoppable truth tellers who answered the call to political service. We also have Donna Brazile, Yolanda Caraway, Tina Flournoy, Leah Daughtery, and my dear Minion. I see and celebrate each one of you, she says. During the years when Minion worked in the Clinton administration, she invited me to various White House events, including the elaborate 1994 state dinner for Nelson Mandela, then President of South Africa. Before the state dinner, Minion had welcomed me to stay with her and child. Why did she do that? Because now, decades later, she cannot get me out of there. Her home has become my haven away from New York. Anytime I'm in the area or just in the mood, I just show up at her doorstep, pull off my wig, my stocking cap, and I settle on to the upstairs bedroom that she keeps ready just for me. What a beautiful human being, that Minion, so full of warmth and exuberance. I cherish that woman, and I don't have to lift a fingernail when I am at her place. Sometimes I sleep, other times my daughter comes with me, and the 3 of us just sit around, cackling over Love and Hip Hop Atlanta, with me trying to keep up with all of these young folks' lingo. Occasionally one of my old films will pop up on Turner Classic Movies. That's my cue to leave the room. No, you're going to sit right here and watch this, Minion always teases. It was on Minion's couch that I, for the first time, sat through the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman from start to finish. I had never gotten used to seeing myself on screen. I hope I never do. A few years later, after I first met Minion, another blessing had flowed my way. In the fall of 1987, Pope John Paul II visited the United States with a stop at the Registry Hotel in Los Angeles. I, along with dozens of other artists and leaders, was invited. My seat was on the aisle, along the right side of the large hall. When the pontiff entered, Silence blanketed the room as all eyes turned toward him. Then, just as I was shifting my focus to the front of the hall to see what was happening there, I felt a hand on my head. It was his. I froze, not sure what he would do next. He didn't utter a sound, as others around us looked on, probably wondering what was happening. He just stood there with his warm palm cradled over my skull. Finally, after a long moment, he lifted his hand, met my eyes, and then made his way to the front of the hall. On how his slow walk to the podium, he did not touch another soul. He delivered his remarks, none of which did I can recall. All I could think of was that day, decades ago in Nevis, when a white dove had landed on my young mother's head. She had been marked. She had been consecrated. She had been anointed and appointed to make the journey to America. I do not understand why the Pope signaled me out, but God did. He knew that. Like my mother before me, I'd need God's favor for the thorny terrain ahead. Okay, guys, that is all of chapter 20. Well, excerpts, because remember, we are only reading parts of it, so sometimes it may sound a little skipped because I am skipping certain parts of the book, not reading it in its entirety, but trying to give you guys some of the juicy parts and the important parts. So I hope you enjoyed chapter 20. And like I said, if you are new and you would like to hear the rest of this, please don't forget you can go to my playlist. I will try to link it in this video so that you can go to it and you can listen to the whole book of my story time with Lynn, reading excerpts from all the chapters of this wonderful woman's life. Thank you guys so very much for joining me for another story time with Lynn. I hope to see you guys in our next video. Remember, hit that like, guys. It is so important. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, I would so love to have you here with the Lynn N Things family. Go ahead and hit that subscribe and let's continue on to that journey of 1,000, my first 1,000 subscribers. Thank you guys so much. Much love until our next video.